Thank you. Ich bin dankbar, dass ich heute hier sprechen kann über eine Idee für peace building and reconciliation. I thought I'd give my speech in German and English, so the German is over now. But I do, before I begin, I'd like to first of all mention the previous speakers briefly. Thank you. Professor Brauch made some very kindly comments about me, so I must return the compliment by saying he's my absolutely favorite German scholar, and you should all be aware that he writes very weighty books. And I mean that in both senses. They're huge. None of his books is less than 1,000 pages, and I have recommended to him that he sell them by the kilo. I also want to mention Professor Cowell for having the chutzpah, the bravery, to mention in this conference on a world without walls that there is a need for some walls. And so I'm glad that you mentioned that. And finally, I mentioned Dr. Stagatorn's approach to the limitation of time. See, I have a 45-minute speech, but I was asked to give it in 4 minutes. But I will...
Just cut to 0.
Yeah. I should mention that the lengthier speech, which is about 45 minutes, were I to read it, is available in the documentation, I think both in paper and electronically. So I'm very pleased that this is a conference on peace building and reconciliation. One of the momentous outcomes of World War II was that the German Reich was in 1945 cut in two, with about 1/3 of its territory and population forming East Germany and the remainder becoming West Germany. And as we all know, for the subsequent 35 years, the two states went their remarkably separate ways politically, socially, and economically. And it is important for me to stress that right up to the 11th hour, essentially no one foresaw the rapid collapse of both the physical and psychological barriers that had so firmly separated the two German states for so long. My only other time in Berlin happened to be a year before the wall came down, and at that time I gave a talk in East Germany, and there was no inkling at that period that there was ever going to be a reconciliation between the two countries. And I'm also pleased to, as a little aside for the moment, to note that one outcome of the reunification has been that there now exists a movement to convert the former fortified strip of land between the two Germanys into a nature-protected greenbelt. And for the next 2 seconds, I mention one other set of countries, and that is in 1990, the two Yemens also became reunified, and the merger occurred despite 2 decades of very serious bilateral hostility, armed conflict, and so on. And the ideological and economic disparities were totally comparable to those in the two Germanys. And here again, the merger was totally unanticipated, and once initiated, it progressed with lightning speed. So as with Germany, it must have been some mix of ethnic, linguistic, cultural, and geographical ties that in the end overcame the huge existing asymmetries. I now come to the remarkably similar story, the basis of this presentation, of yet another national division that occurred halfway around the world only a few years after Germany's unfortunate dissection. And thus one of the momentous outcomes of World War II plus the Korean War, was that the Korean state was in 1953 also cut in two, with about 1/2 of its territory and 1/3 of its population forming North Korea and the remainder becoming South Korea. Once again, the two states went their remarkably separate ways, politically, socially, and economically. But here the three stories diverge, inasmuch as the Korean separation has for 57 long years now remained with very minor fluctuations about as firm as ever, and thus with no credible inkling as yet of reunification. Indeed, the two sides continue to function separately within a framework of what was meant to be the temporary armistice agreement in 1953, and there is no peace treaty. We heard earlier this morning that there are very few peace treaties kicking around since in recent history. Well, here's another case. It's my hope for the future of the Korean Peninsula that its two still antagonistic states will at some point be reconciled. And this depends on progress in two main areas. First, to be able at last to witness a peaceful and mutually beneficial formal end to the war. It happens that I myself fought half a century ago in that war under UN command. And second, to be able to help ensure the environmental integrity of that peninsula, without which the long-term health and well-being of its people and its wildlife would be in certain jeopardy. Fortunately, those two areas of concern could, in my view, be fruitfully linked in that progress with the latter one, progress with environmental conservation, could facilitate success with the former one, the progress with political rapprochement. For a region such as the Korean Peninsula to offer an appropriate home both for its human inhabitants and for as many as possible of the remaining native plants and animals requires a combination of two things. One, the sensitive use of all the land sequestered for agriculture, industry, transportation, and so forth, and two, the setting aside of some fraction of the peninsula as protected areas for the native flora and fauna. The first of those two requirements, the sensitive use of all the lands, is quite inadequately met in both North and South Korea and will require really substantial educational efforts, legislation, and enforcement, but I'm not going to talk about that. The second of those two concerns, the de jure protection of some areas as nature reserves, as biosanctuaries, is even more seriously deficient in both the North and South. And this leads me to what I want to say next. The present paucity of protected habitats on the Korean Peninsula has deprived the peoples of the region of the many subtle, continuing benefits deriving from adequate expanses of natural areas, the so-called ecosystem services. I'll skip enumerating those. You can read about those in my paper. The armistice agreement that ended the North-South hostilities established a military demarcation line between the two states, which, as it happens, I helped to survey in 1952. And this demarcation line is flanked by a demilitarized zone, the DMZ, roughly an east-west greenbelt that traverses a full range of habitats: saltwater and freshwater, lowland and wetland, upland and highland, grassland and woodland. And it's about 1,000 square kilometers in size. And found in the DMZ are about 1/3 of the peninsula's plants, 1/2 of its mammals, and about 1/5 of its birds. And so it's a wonderfully important ecological area of importance to the peninsula. And one of the reasons, of course, is for over half a century now, the area has been largely undisturbed, so it has on its own accord, to a great extent, recovered. And I just mentioned very briefly that the wetlands in the area are crucial for the wintering grounds for these various charismatic and imperiled birds, such as cranes and egrets and ibises and spoonbills and storks. These annually migrate between Korea and depend upon the DMZ now because so much else of the peninsula is taken over by human activities, and they migrate from Korea to China, Russia, Japan, and back and forth. So the DMZ could become a centerpiece of any effort to work toward environmental sustainability for the peninsula. If the DMZ were to be conserved in perpetuity, it would serve the crucial function of helping to conserve the Korean Peninsula's environment, at the same time serving as an inspiring memorial to the many soldiers and civilians of both sides who had lost their lives during the hostilities. And as I would like to develop next, I think this is a wonderful, a magnificent, apolitical, and I stress apolitical, avenue and ultimate monument to peace between two presently very uneasy neighbors, and possibly even in time to their reunification. So, thinking about the DMZ as a confidence-building measure is, I think, a very important aspect of this. There was some interest, by the way, at one point. In 1991, oddly enough, North Korea came to the Secretary General of the UN and asked to have the UN explore that possibility of converting the DMZ into a nature reserve. The Secretary General, Kofi Annan, then in turn handed that over to the Environment Program, to Tolba, and it happened that I was working for the UN at that time, and I in turn was the person who got the job to try to follow up on that notion. Well, to make a long story short, nothing really panned out. The South Koreans were more or less interested, and the North Koreans quite soon backed off and said the political situation wasn't ripe, all depending upon U.S. forces in South Korea and nuclear issues and one thing and another that had nothing to do with the DMZ. This is a pity, because at one point even, I think in 1997, the president of South Korea gave a speech at the UN General Assembly in opening it, that session, in which he again suggested that the DMZ should be turned into a zone of peace and ecological integrity, and the North Koreans made an abrupt statement that existing political problems continued to prevent such a possibility. Well, I'll cut a few things out here and suggest that my concern is that, as was the case with Germany, as the two Germanys, as was the case with the two Yemens, all of a sudden, out of a clear blue sky, despite very minor indications or suggestions that there be reunification, it happened. It happened overnight, so to speak. And although right now there is absolutely no indication that North Korea and South Korea are going to reach any kind of rapprochement, my concern is that it may happen. And if it does happen before the DMZ is established as a protected area, it'll be too late, because it'll be gobbled up for agriculture and industry and one thing and another. So now is the time to take diplomatic advantage of that ever-urgent need to do this. There are a whole bunch of background suggestions, other areas. There are about 24 transfrontier reserves that have been legally established. The first one was in 1924 between what is Poland and what was then Czechoslovakia, and then more recently a very interesting one between Ecuador and Peru, which give some very good precedents for the Koreans to follow. And so what I have done, actually, and it's attached to my paper that's available, is to prepare a draft memorandum of understanding which the two countries should adopt, and I have actually made arrangements to see the two ambassadors to North and South Korea to the UN in January to present this in some sort of a formal way. But I have presented an MOU which is very permissive, very non-threatening, and lets the two countries only agree to the fact that they will unilaterally start protecting their part of the DMZ with the possible future intention of linking the southern activities with the northern ones. So let me conclude by saying it's my hope, and that what I'm suggesting here is a diplomatic confidence-building measure that would ameliorate a half-century of fear and distrust between the two Koreas that will in time perhaps lead to the reconciliation, and then make it one wall less for next year's conference. So I hope I got my time done.
I'd like to